All right, so D'Angelo Russell traded from the Lakers again. Back to Brooklyn, of all places. But hold on, because this deep dive is going to be about more than just déjà vu. We got our stack of articles and insights here.
Yeah.
And we're going to unearth what this trade really tells us about the Lakers' future, the Nets' strategy.
Yeah.
And maybe even a bit about, like, the shifting landscape of the NBA itself.
It is kind of funny, isn't it? Like, at first glance, this trade might look like just like a minor roster shuffle.
Yeah.
You know, D'Angelo Russell and Maxwell Lewis to the Nets, Dorian Finney-Smith and Shake Milton to the Lakers. A few second-round picks are sprinkled in, but trust me, the implications of this are anything but minor.
Okay, so walk me through this. Why is this trade more about tomorrow than today? And what does it say about what each team is trying to build?
Let's start with the Lakers. You know how they've been like looking for a solid wing player all season? Well, Finney-Smith is exactly that, a 3-and-D guy. He brings size and defense, things that they've desperately lacked. But the real key here is what this move allows them to do next. They've been trying to move Russell's contract for 2 seasons now, and this finally gives them the breathing room to potentially make some big splashes in the future.
So it's like clearing the runway for a major signing or trade down the line.
Precisely. Getting rid of Russell's hefty contract opens up like a world of possibilities for them. Suddenly a guy like De'Aaron Fox, you know, if he were to become available, that isn't like a pipe dream anymore. And even if they don't swing for the fences, they could explore smaller, more targeted deals. For guys like Bojan Bogdanovic or Jonas Valanciunas. And crucially, they held on to their first-round draft picks. Those are like gold in the trade market.
It kind of reminds me a bit of the Rui Hachimura trade, that kind of savvy in-between move to improve the team without sacrificing the future. But for this to really work out, the Lakers need to see a pretty big defensive turnaround, right?
Absolutely. If this trade doesn't translate into a significantly improved defense, it won't really have the impact they're hoping for. They're banking on Finney-Smith to be like a defensive anchor, which will allow LeBron and AD to focus more on offense.
All right, so let's switch gears and talk about the Nets for a sec. They're in full-on asset accumulation mode, there's no question. But you mentioned something interesting earlier, that they might have actually been able to get more for Finney-Smith. I'm curious, why do you think he was potentially undervalued in this deal?
Well, Finney-Smith is a solid player, but he's not flashy. His value really lies in his consistency and his defensive prowess. Those are things that don't always grab headlines. The Nets, with their eyes on the future, they prioritize getting younger and shedding salary. They likely see this as just one piece in like a larger puzzle.
Speaking of that puzzle, they also made that Dennis Schroeder trade recently. Are we seeing a pattern here?
Absolutely. It wouldn't be surprising to see guys like Cam Johnson or Nick Claxton on the move next. They're clearly building for a future that doesn't involve competing for a championship this year.
And you know what? As a Nets fan, part of me is actually rooting for them to keep losing. The worse their record, the better their chances of landing a top draft pick.
Right.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about D'Angelo Russell. Now, he might not be the missing piece for like a championship contender,
Right.
but I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up playing a key role on a playoff team somewhere. He's got talent,
And
he was arguably underutilized in LA.
which brings up a fascinating question. If the Nets buy him out, where could he land?
That's where things get interesting. A lot of contenders are already bumping up against the salary cap, and that dreaded second apron rule makes things tricky.
Ah, yes, second apron rule. For those of us who might not have a PhD in NBA salary cap intricacies, could you break that down a bit? What does that mean for D'Angelo Russell's options?
Think of it this way. The second apron is basically like a line in the sand for high-spending teams. If they cross it, they face severe restrictions. Like they're unable to use certain exceptions to sign players, even buyout guys. So for Russell, this eliminates some potential landing spots, like Boston or Golden State, teams who are already deep into luxury tax territory.
Okay, so contenders with limited spending power, got it. But who specifically do you think could really benefit from having D'Angelo Russell on their roster?
That's a great question, and one we should definitely delve into further.
Speaking of delving further before we get lost in hypotheticals, let's touch on how the experts are grading this trade. I've seen a lot of Bs thrown around. B- for the Lakers, BB+ for the Nets.
Yeah, those grades are pretty spot on, I'd say. It's all about weighing the potential long-term benefits against the immediate impact. The Lakers took a calculated risk to improve their roster. Now A&D gained flexibility for the future, while the Nets committed to their rebuild.
But how will both teams approach the upcoming trade deadline now? Will the Lakers make another move to solidify their contender status? Will the Nets continue tearing it down? So many questions still hanging in the air.
Exactly. This trade has opened up a whole new set of possibilities, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface.
I know. Well, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. I'm ready to dive deeper into this trade and all its potential ramifications, let's pick up the conversation in part 2.
So you asked which teams could benefit from having D'Angelo Russell on their roster. It's a bit of a guessing game without knowing who will be active in the buyout market. But let's speculate a little, shall we?
Let's do it. It's not like we have a crystal ball or anything.
Okay.
But it's fun to play armchair GM, right?
Exactly. So one team that immediately comes to mind is the Los Angeles Clippers. They've been leaning heavily on Kawhi Leonard and Paul George to generate offense. And a secondary ball handler like Russell could take some of the pressure off those guys.
That's a good point. And wouldn't his ability to create his own shot be a valuable asset for them, especially come playoff time?
Absolutely. Remember, Russell averaged 17.8 points and 6.2 assists with the Lakers this season. Those aren't empty stats. He can make things happen on offense.
All right, so the Clippers make sense. Any other teams that pique your interest?
The Phoenix Suns could be an intriguing fit. They have a formidable starting lineup, but their bench scoring could use a boost, especially with Chris Paul not getting any younger.
I see what you're saying. Russell could provide that spark off the bench that they might lack, in a deep playoff run.
Precisely. He could be a valuable asset for a team looking to make a serious championship push. Of course, there are other factors at play here, like team chemistry and coaching style. But purely in terms of skill set, Russell could thrive in a situation where he's given the freedom to orchestrate the offense.
Okay, so we've got the Clippers and the Suns as potential landing spots. Let's shift gears a bit and circle back to those trade grades we mentioned earlier. The Lakers received a B-, which isn't bad, but it's not stellar either. What makes this trade less than an A in your book?
Well, while Finney-Smith is a solid player, he's not a game changer. He's a role player, a very good one, but still a role player. And he's on an expiring contract, so the Lakers are essentially renting him for the rest of the season.
So there's a risk they could lose him in free agency.
There is. And even if they manage to re-sign him, it's still unclear if he's the missing piece, the one that will propel them to contender status, especially in a loaded Western Conference.
That's fair. And let's not forget the age factor. Finney-Smith is 30 years old, so he's not exactly a spring chicken.
True. But he's known for his durability and consistent performance. I wouldn't be overly concerned about his age just yet.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the Nets received a BB+, slightly higher than the Lakers. What's the logic behind that?
Well, the Nets accomplished what they set out to do. They shed salary, they acquired some assets, and they positioned themselves for a potential high draft pick. It's a classic rebuild move.
So on paper, it looks like a win-win for them.
It does. But the true test will be how they utilize those assets they've accumulated. If they can leverage those draft picks to acquire a star player down the line, then this trade will look even better in hindsight.
That makes sense. It's all about the long game for them. Now let's zoom out a bit and consider the bigger picture. This trade, along with other recent moves we've seen across the league, seems to indicate a shift in how teams are approaching roster construction.
I agree. We're seeing a growing emphasis on flexibility and future assets over immediate success. It's a departure from the super team model that dominated the league for a while.
And is that shift in philosophy partly driven by the new CBA and that pesky second apron rule we discussed earlier?
Absolutely. The new CBA has made it significantly more difficult and expensive for teams to maintain super teams. The second apron rule in particular has imposed strict limitations on high-spending teams. It's forcing them to be more strategic and creative with their roster management.
So are we entering a new era of parity in the NBA, where more teams have a legitimate shot at contending?
I think that's a fair assessment. This emphasis on financial prudence and long-term planning has leveled the playing field to a certain extent. It's making the regular season more competitive and the playoffs more unpredictable.
That's good for the fans, right? More excitement, more drama. Who doesn't love a good underdog story?
Exactly. Now, speaking of underdogs, let's go back to D'Angelo Russell for a moment. You mentioned earlier that he was arguably underutilized in LA. Could you elaborate on that? What specifically do you think went wrong there?
Well, to be fair to Russell, he was playing alongside LeBron James, one of the most dominant players in NBA history. It's not always easy to shine when you're sharing the court with a superstar like that.
That's a valid point, and there were definitely moments when Russell showcased his talent and potential, but there also seemed to be a disconnect between his playing style and the Lakers' overall system.
Specifically, there were reports of a lack of chemistry between Russell and LeBron. Their playing styles didn't always mesh, and there were rumors of tension off the court.
Right. And I think the coaching staff didn't always utilize Russell's skills to their fullest extent. He's a gifted scorer and passer, but he often found himself relegated to a more passive role.
So you believe a change of scenery could be beneficial for him? that he needs to be in an environment where he has the trust of the coaching staff
Mm-hmm.
and the freedom to play his game.
I do. He needs to be on a team where he's viewed as a core piece, not just a complementary player. A team that can build their offense around his strengths.
Which are? Remind us what D'Angelo Russell does well.
He's an excellent ball handler, a creative playmaker, and a capable scorer from all three levels. He can create his own shot, facilitate for his teammates, and knock down the open jumper. He's also a decent rebounder for a guard.
But his defense is still a question mark, right? He's not exactly known for locking down opponents.
That's true. Defense has never been his strong suit.
Yeah.
But he's not a complete liability on that end either. He's shown flashes of competence. And with the right coaching and effort, he could become a more reliable defender.
So in the right system, with the right supporting cast, he could be a very impactful player.
Absolutely. He has the potential to be a 20-point, 8-assist guy on a winning team.
This trade might actually be a blessing in disguise for him, a chance to reset and prove himself all over again.
I think that's a great way to look at it. Sometimes a fresh start is all a player needs to unlock their full potential.
It's wild, isn't it? One trade just sends shockwaves through the whole league. Like everyone's reassessing, looking for opportunities to capitalize on this new landscape.
Yeah, it's true. This Russell trade has thrown a wrench into things, and I have a feeling we're going to see a lot more action before the trade deadline.
You mentioned before that the Lakers might need to make another move to become true contenders. What kind of players should they be targeting?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? They need someone who can complement LeBron James and Anthony Davis, not overshadow them. Someone who can address their remaining weaknesses without disrupting their existing chemistry.
So they've already got the dominant big men, and they just added a solid 3-and-D guy in Finney-Smith. What's the missing piece?
Well, I think another wing player would make a lot of sense. Someone who can consistently knock down threes, defend multiple positions, and maybe even create their own shot in a pinch.
Someone who can kind of take some of that scoring burden off LeBron's shoulders, especially as he gets deeper into his, let's just say his later years.
Exactly. The Lakers need a player who can provide that secondary scoring punch, especially in those crucial playoff moments when defenses are keyed in on LeBron and AD.
And maybe someone with a bit of youthful energy as well. Someone who can push the pace and bring an extra spark to the team.
That would definitely be an asset. Finding the right blend of veteran experience and youthful exuberance is always a challenge, but it's crucial for a team with championship aspirations.
It's a delicate balance for sure. But if the Lakers can pull it off, they could be like a formidable force in the playoffs.
No doubt about it. And remember, they still have LeBron James. Even at this stage of his career, he's a game changer.
He's defied Father Time for so long, it's almost become expected. But like you said earlier, they can't rely on him to do it all.
Right. They need to surround him with the right supporting cast, players who can contribute on both ends of the floor, and, just make his life easier.
So it's not just about talent. It's about finding the right pieces that fit together, that complement each other's strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. It's about building a cohesive unit, a team that's greater than the sum of its parts.
That's what separates the true contenders from the pretenders.
Well said. And that's what makes this trade deadline so intriguing. We're going to see which teams are willing to take risks, to make those bold moves that could potentially alter their destiny.
Speaking of risks, let's talk about the Nets for a moment. They've taken a big gamble by embracing this youth movement and tearing down their roster. But it's a gamble that could pay off handsomely down the road.
It could. They've got a lot of promising young players, and they're in a great position to add even more talent through the draft. But there's always a risk associated with rebuilding. There's no guarantee that these young players will develop into stars, and there's always the possibility of making a misstep in the draft.
So it's a long-term play, and it requires a lot of patience and trust from the fans.
It does. And it requires a clear vision from the front office, a plan for how to navigate this rebuilding process, and emerge as a contender in a few years.
This D'Angelo Russell trade is just the latest chapter in what promises to be a fascinating story for both the Lakers and the Nets. We'll be watching closely to see how it all unfolds.
Me too. And I have a feeling we'll be having many more of these deep dives as the NBA landscape continues to shift and evolve.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered just about everything there is to cover on this trade. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. We've talked a lot about the Lakers' need to make another move. But what if they don't? What if they decide to stand pat with their current roster and see how things play out? Is that a recipe for success, or are they setting themselves up for disappointment?
That's a great question, and honestly, there's no easy answer. It's a gamble either way. Making a move could disrupt their chemistry and backfire, while standing pat could leave them shorthanded against the elite teams in the league.
It's a classic dilemma.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's up to the Lakers front office to make the tough decisions.
And as fans, all we can do is sit back, enjoy the ride, and see how it all plays out.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to tune in next time for another insightful look at the biggest stories in the NBA.